All right, our next topic, presentation, Second to None by Joe Freeman. Joe Freeman.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I always enjoy coming back to Watkins Glen for a couple of reasons. At least two of them are, one, I won my first Formula Ford race here against 25 or 28 other guys, which was pretty exciting. It was also the first Formula Ford race that was held on the new long track, so I was pretty pleased about that. Went home smiling, thinking, of course, I was going to be a Grand Prix champion, which I was not. The second was when I came for an IMSA race that they had for Formula Fords, and had my first comprehensive wreck. I got the red mist and drove over the guy in front of me who was holding me up, and ended up in the guardrail and came out with a very bent car and luckily not too many injuries, but an abashed sense of competition. The red mist does work. The talk I'm giving today is based on a book, which you'll see back there. You can look through. It's called Second to One. It's an idea that I had several years ago about knowing that there were so many really interesting drivers who had taken second in Indianapolis and were champions and whatnot, and never got any recognition, and nobody knew about them. Or at least if they knew about them, they didn't think that they were of significance. So I felt, let's do a book on that, and it really came out, I think, quite well. But in this case, I've changed the name because I've chosen three of these drivers who were really major contributors to American racing. And so it's second to none, because these guys really were, in some ways, not just second to one, but second to none in the sense of their contribution to American racing and to the Indianapolis 500. The first is a man by the name of Earl Cooper. I'm not sure if this name is familiar to you, a lot of you. He was as you can see, a three-time national champion, 1913, 1915, 1916. And that era literally went from everything from racing on open roads through parts of California where he and other road races on the West Coast, in Tacoma and whatnot, through the first major board tracks, one of which was in Chicago, another of which was in Sheepshead Bay, New York. And I hope all of you are familiar with the fact that there was an era in which all the major championship racing was done on high-banked board tracks, board speedways. If not, come see me later. Anyway, Earl was second in Indy in 1924, but he was also a constructor and an engineer. This photo is of when he first joined Stutz. Harry Stutz was a tough guy to work for, but Earl really did, he knew how to do it. He had started out in Maxwell, but he was a superb racer. And as a result, he won, I think it was something like 23 national championship races. And he teamed up with a mechanic by the name of Reeves Dutton, and the two of them were practically unbeatable. This is driving in big, open Stutz Bearcats, basically, a mixture of your sports and racing car. And again, in all over the country, he really was. He was a remarkable driver. He was not a big man, and yet he would do these literally 300 mile an hour, 300 mile and 400 mile races. I don't know how he did it, but he was really good at it. And Reeves Dutton could take apart and put back anything, anytime, and was a huge help to him. So that as a team, that's one of the reasons why they won 3 national championships. By the way, I have to preface that with a little asterisk by saying that in 1913 and 1915, there was no national championship. It was only later on that the AAA established a national championship in 1916 first. And as a result, it was magazines of the day, the Motor Age, Horseless Age, that declared someone was a champion. And they declared Earl Cooper as being a champion. This is just an example. I believe that's we got a little ahead of ourselves there, sorry. Let's go back to, well, no, oh yeah, okay, good. I think this is the governor of California, but under any circumstances, he really was a major driver at his time. Let me catch up here. I just have to be careful not to go too fast here. Again, this is him receiving a major trophy. In 1919, having won all those championships and having been a really superb and well-known sports figure, I mean, a Honus Wagner or a Kai Cobb in some ways in his own day, he decided to retire. And this is a kind of fun shot I put in. This is taken in Tacoma, Washington. That's a big Stutz touring car. He's going fishing, and he's going to relax for life. But then in 1921, a guy by the name of Joe Thomas, who was driving for Duesenberg, was riding a horse, fell off the horse, broke his leg, and Cooper was there, and they said, well, why don't you drive his car? Not only did he drive the car on the Fresno board track, he won the race. By the way, it's the only time he ever drove at Duesenberg. But the fact was he was able to literally, after 3 years of total time off, beat the best. And Jimmy Murphy and, well, Jimmy Murphy wasn't really in full blast at that time, but Tommy Milton and a whole series of other really great drivers. So that's, by the way, a fellow by the name of Al Nielsen beside him, one of the Duesenberg mechanics who accompanied him on that win. Here he is in his, it's labeled a big Studebaker, but it's not. As I think most of you will know, it's a Miller. It's a Miller 122, not a 91. And you can see, by the way, in the bottom of there, those are the updraft carburetors underneath the frame. That was prior to the time that they had supercharging for these Millers. This was very much the same as the car that won the race, which was Tommy Milton's Miller that looked almost exactly the same. But Earl was pretty good at selling sponsorship, so he got initially a Studebaker, and then eventually a Studebaker dealer in San Francisco to sponsor him, called Weaver. But so he continued racing and continued winning races, major races, 250 milers, generally on these board tracks. That's what they ran. And at the same time, he could drive almost anything that you put him in. This is one of Miller's early front drive cars that initially were developed in 1924. And by the way, the car that nearly beat him or nearly won the race in 1924 was a front drive Miller. These were incredible machines. They had some weaknesses, but overall they were really fast. He put this on the pole in Indianapolis that year, but as it happens, well, he also wrecked it, but not in the race. But he was he didn't finish the race. The gearbox broke, as they did quite regularly on the Miller front drives. That was a weakness. But then he did decide to retire again, and when he retired, but he didn't retire altogether. He made a deal with Dutton. He and Dutton got some money from Buick, which is why there's this odd radiator shell there. And they built their own front drive that they thought would be better than the Millers. The Cooper front drives, I think they built 3 or possibly 4 of them. This is one of them that entered the 500. This is another one. It's a little hard to see Earl behind there, but he is there along with Reeves Dutton. They didn't finish the race, but what was important about these is he was one of the very few people who actually decided to build and enter cars at Indianapolis, as well as be a driver after he'd finished driving. They were successful enough so that these chassis continued on. I think that there's still, well, I know there's still at least one around, and I think they continued racing at Indianapolis after the Second World War. They were modified in all sorts of different ways, but the Coopers were just known. You can see his engine configuration was a little different. It was a straight 8, double overhead camshaft engine, but his exhaust system and the trying to get the car as low as possible was one of the things that he was attempting to do with this particular design. So after he finished with that project, why he went on, he became a car dealer for Marmon, and at the same time kept his his involvement with racing throughout his career. He worked for the Union Oil Company and developed a number of different products for them. He was also, by the way, one of the earliest people to use ethyl lead for his engines in the 500. He and Tommy Milton were there. And he stuck around Indianapolis. Here he is in his latter years with Pete DiPaolo. He remained an official until his death, and was, again, an extremely well-known American sports figure who was very much appreciated. Earl the Pearl, they called him. Also, the California Comet. He had a lot of different names, but he was a really quick guy. The next person I've chosen is Harry Hartz. Harry Hartz was a really interesting fellow. He started out as a, well, here's his rundown. He was a national champion in 1926. He won 7 major board track championship wins. Second in Indy in 3 times, 1922, 23, 26. IndyCar entrant from 1930 to 1940. And wins as an owner in 1930 and 1932 at Indianapolis. So no small hitter. He started out, there's a nice portrait of him. The Chevrolet is a reference to his time when he was being a mechanic for Billy Durant's son, Cliff Durant, who was promoting Chevrolets at the time, and they were racing together. So that's why he has that Chevrolet badge on. But he started out as a kid racing these small race cars that were basically motorcycle engined creatures. There were actually quite a few of them. A few have survived. And they had races on board tracks the same way, and also on road courses. I think they raced in Santa Monica, etc. And he got his first name through those, and he called himself the junior racing champion of the world. I think, well, maybe he was. I'm not sure. I don't know how many kids were doing that at the time. But he also, as he grew older, he associated himself with various folks, including a very well-known driver by the name of Eddie Hearn. Hearn had one of the 1915 championship-winning Stutzes that were remarkable cars. Believe it or not, they built 4. And 2 are still in existence, one in the United States in Los Angeles, in the Los Angeles County Museum, and the other in New Zealand. They were hugely successful. Harry Stutz used them as a promotion, but then when they won the 1915 championship, he said, "I'm done with racing. I don't want it anymore." And he sold his cars, and at least some of them, and maybe all of them, went to Cooper, but eventually ended up in the hands of Cliff Durant, who was racing them. And this is Harry working on the engine. By the way, you can see it's a single overhead cam engine with the exposed valves and whatnot. But in the day, they were light, fast, and could win on road courses, on board tracks, and on sand, just about anywhere they wanted to race. This is a picture of his first win at Indianapolis. Sorry, it's not the best quality of picture that I have, but it's a Duesenberg, and it was a Duesenberg that actually is we believe, if it's correct, yes. This is the actual car that is still in existence. It's in Fred Simeon's collection. I'm sorry, it's not that car, but it's one of the 3 cars that were taken to France in the 1921 French Grand Prix. Jimmy Murphy won with his, and the one driven by Joe Boyer, another driver, was brought back. Harry Hartz bought it, and that's it. That car is still in existence and very, very original. It's amazing that it survived all the years through its racing. It raced in California, it raced in the East, eventually was bought by, they tried it at Indianapolis later on, didn't work. Fred Simeon's father bought it from a family by the name of Bergert, who owned it at the time, kept it, and I had to convince Fred that he had one of the most important racing cars in the United States. He wanted to keep it the way it was. It had been for 1930, but when I sent him a lengthy article I'd written about it, he called me up and said, "Joe, I had no idea you knew that much about this car. I'm going to restore this and restore it as a real racing Duesenberg." So if you go to Philadelphia and you look at that car is there. It's one of Fred's really remarkable machines. He continued, by the way, with that car he raced in 22 was a full Duesenberg with a Duesenberg engine, but by 1923, Jimmy Murphy had bought a Miller double overhead cam engine, which seemed to work better than the single overhead cam Duesenbergs, the 183 cars that were 183 cubic inch cars. And as a result, Murphy bought a Miller and put it in his Duesenberg chassis and called it the Miller Special. He won the Indianapolis 500 with it. Seeing that, Hartz, not to be left behind, got his own Miller engine and put a Miller nose on it on the Duesenberg, and this is him on a board track racing that in the latter part of 1922 and in 1923. But by the time that Indianapolis rolled around in 1923, why the Millers had become basically almost ubiquitous, sponsored by the first real big, you might say, swatch of them, I think 4 or 5, were built with money from, again, if you can see the side there, his sponsor, Cliff Durant. Cliff Durant actually is an unknown figure in a lot of American racing. He was the son of Billy Durant, who founded General Motors, and believe me, his money paid basically for a lot of innovation that, including, for example, the front drives that really transformed American championship racing, particularly during this board track era. Finally, the third second place was in 1926. That's the year that Frank Lockhart won in the rain, but you can imagine, here's Harry again. I got to say, he must have been enormously frustrated by the fact that he'd taken second 3 times, just coming within inches of winning the big race, but never did. But he continued his career until 1927. He got one of the front drives and made a national championship in that year, in 1926. He also set several close course world records, including one at a board track speedway in Amotol, New Jersey. It was a track named after an munitions factory that was built there. In any case, and he won he set a world record for a 300-mile distance. I've forgotten what it was, but these were 1,500 cc engines, and I believe it was, the average for the race was over 130 miles an hour, if you can imagine that. Double overhead camshaft, small pistons. Gordon White here had brought along one one of the little 91 pistons. It's amazing to see, but these cars were incredibly fast for their size. By the way, they were also all supercharged at the time, and that technology had been pretty well developed, and they'd also improved on lubricants and fuels, along with tires. There were a lot of word track innovations that came along as racing matured. It basically, between the competition between first Louis Chevrolet, the Duesenberg brothers, Fred Naughey, and of course Harry Miller, who Gordon will talk about later. Harry had a really serious accident in New Hampshire at the board track there, nearly killed him. He was very badly injured, but was burned, broke ribs, broke arms, and whatnot, and basically, I think, probably damaged his brain enough so he was never able to race again. But he stuck around, and lo and behold, he started to enter his own cars at Indianapolis. And this is one of them. This is from I believe it's the car from 1932, which was a winner. That huge trophy, by the way, if you don't recognize it, is one of the crown jewels of the collection of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway Museum. It was made by Tiffany. It's called the Wheeler-Schiebler Trophy, and it's given to the car that's leading at 400 miles. Well, it's an amazing trophy. I've seen it in person. They had it at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston for a Tiffany exhibit. It's just incredible. If you get there, again, they don't put it on display. I don't quite understand why. Here we have again some of the old timers. That's from left to right, Babe Stapp, who was a regular racer at the time, but had retired by this time. Earl Cooper. This is in Indianapolis, of course. Tommy Milton, who was the chief steward at that time. You can see on his AAA car, and Harry Hartz to the right. So these guys were the old timers around Indianapolis, but they were very well respected. They were all served as various shall we say, officials and sort of advisors to Rickenbacker, and then after the track was sold to the people who owned it after Rickenbacker. Here's another group of interesting people. Left to right, again, Peter DiPaolo, who was, of course, a winner several times. Eddie Hearn behind him, who Harry had been a mechanic for. And the infamous Mike Boyle in the middle. Umbrella Mike, if you haven't read that story or know that, again, come around and ask me about it. He was quite a character. And Harry Hartz. So this was, they were, again, hanging around Indianapolis at the time, getting ready for the 500. Again, this is the sort of final picture of Harry. He was basically got very old. I think he died. This was taken in 1971. He died in 74. But again, sadly, an unknown figure, a man who really contributed to the race in a lot of different ways, and drove a lot of different cars. He drove cars on the Salt. He drove cars, he drove a car backwards across the United States and set a record. So it's quite an interesting character. All these guys were. I'm picking these because they're kind of fun and interesting. Finally, we got Lou Moore. Lou was not as much of a standout racer, although he certainly did well. He started in a very competitive racing in California at a track called Ascot, not the Ascot you know nowadays, but it was a very, very popular track during the 30s. Very competitive. So a whole number of major drivers came out of there, including, say, Rex Mays, and oh gosh, the names would go on and on, who were racing it and who developed their skills at Ascot, which was not, by the way, it was a packed dirt racetrack. I think about I want to say it was a little longer than a half mile. I think it was maybe about three quarters of a mile. You can see he was second in Indy in 1928, but kept racing during the so-called junk formula era, when Indy cars had gone back to riding mechanics and supposedly to get manufacturers involved. At the same time, he finished third in 1933 and 1934, then he himself turned to be an Indy entrant. There's a good shot of him as a driver, and one early shot of him. This is the number 28 car, is the one he took second in. A copy of that car is called the Majestic Miller, bright green, by the way. Green was not allowed in Indianapolis for a long time. They thought it was a hoodoo, but it was green anyway. But in this particular case, it was before it was the Majestic Miller. It was that next year. So there he is. Here he is in one of the two-man cars again. There's Mike Boyle's name coming up, and I think this is one of the cars he finished third in. But he himself felt he should retire. He wasn't doing well enough, and so as a result, he himself turned to being an entrant. He encouraged a car builder by the name of Curly Wetteruth to build a very, by the way, by this time in 1937, Indy had returned, or 38 had returned to one-man chassis, and in 1939, Lou Moore entered this Wetteruth chassis with I believe my names are failing me here, but I believe that's Floyd Davis. Floyd won the race for him. The first race he's won an entrant. Floyd was killed in the next Indy 500, sadly. But in the next year, 1941, I believe, he hired Murray Rose, who was an up-and-coming young driver at the time, Rose, along with another driver, took his car, again that Wetteruth, and won the Indy a second time. So he was a two-time winner by that time. He, of course, took time off during the war, but then following the war, it was sort of a mixture in 1946 of cars that had just been assembled together. But Lou Moore said, no, I want to build something really original. And so he embarked on building these very radical front drive cars. They were made by a man by the name of Emil Diet. And they were very successful. They had a low sense of gravity, and as a result, Murray Rose was able to dominate the Indianapolis 500 for 2 years running, in 1947 and 1948, winning the race there. So 2 more wins for Lou. And finally, Rose's partner, Bill Holland, was not too pleased, particularly in the second time around, about being beaten by Rose. But Rose broke in 49, and as a result, Holland won his race. So Lou Moore was truly a magnificent and interesting character, and not only in terms of the innovation he brought to the track, but also the success for the Indy 500. Here's the final entry that he had. It was in 1950, final entry that actually made the race. In 1952, with again one of his front drive cars, that's Tony Bettenhausen, who drove for him for 3 years. But by that time, the cars were really out of competition. They weren't competitive. In any case, all of this information I've gone through has come out of the book that I've done here. It's second to one. It was an idea that occurred to me, as I say, because I felt it was really important. There are about 40 drivers in here who were, and their names in there, again, like these folks, but Rex Mays, and of course, probably the most famous would be Michael Andretti, who wrote the Ford for us was incredible. How many times he came close to winning the race and didn't. The Andretti curse really covered his career. So that's about it. Other than to say that I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to take us back to some of the history of American racing when it was really a successful and major sport in the United States. Sadly now I could ask people in the room how many people would know who the national champion was, who won the national championship this year. Can anybody tell me who won the national championship this year? Nobody? Who won the national championship of American racing, of IndyCar racing? Yeah, that shows how unfortunately, sadly, American racing, particularly open wheel racing, but all American racing has been just the television ratings are zero. The emphasis is going away, even for NASCAR as well as others. So that's a whole nother topic. But I thank you, and I hope you've enjoyed my kind of race through a couple of three guys who are really kind of interesting early drivers.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you. Stay put. We'll see if I have any questions.
Yes.
Gordon White.
Oh,
For any of you who don't know, Joe has become a publisher, and he's published one of my books as well as a number of other what I think are important racing books.
Okay.
Thank you. Do we have another question?
Okay.
Yes, over to the left.
My name is John Ock. Just a question on Louis Chevrolet and a little history on his racing at Indy.
Louis, I'm trying to remember how many times he raced at Indy, and I don't recall right offhand, but he initially came to the United States, actually to Canada, as a chauffeur, then was hired in New York. The first major race he did was one of the Vanderbilt Cup, and I want to say, oh, I'm sorry, as I say, I think it was 1904, 1905. It was his first a race on Long Island. He drove a car for a guy, a big Fiat, had a wreck, nearly killed himself. But he continued racing on and off. But primarily, he wanted to build his own car, and he went to Billy Durant and said, "I want to build a Chevrolet." Well, Billy Durant said, "Fine," but what Durant had in mind, what Chevrolet had in mind, Louis Chevrolet had in mind, was a quality car. What Billy Durant had in mind was something to compete with the Model T Ford. Well, Durant won and came out basically turning a car that was called the Little at the time into the first two Chevrolets, the Royal Mail, and I tend to forget the name of the second. And so Louis was totally disinterested. He built his own racing cars called Frontenacs that competed with the Duesenbergs and eventually Harry Millers. But then subsequently he and, one of his brothers, he had three brothers who came to the States. One was killed, sadly, in 1920 at a race in Los Angeles on one of the board tracks. Then he and his other brother started a company called Frontenac, and they made speed equipment for Model T Fords. Literally first just hot up systems to improve the engine, but primarily to heighten its fuel consumption. But then eventually went to overhead valve systems. The first one called single stick, and the second one then called a Dio. Those are very rare. I think they only built about 3 or 4 of them, but they were very successful well into the 30s. So he had a full career in racing and around racing, but he was not as a driver. He competed at Indianapolis, but I'm sorry, I can't remember exactly which years, and and what cars he drove. I should know, but I'm a little blank on that. I'll look it up. By the way, one just tool that some of you might want to learn to use, which I've found hugely valuable, is called champcarstats.com, www.champcarstats.com. If you go on there, it's got all the drivers, a lot of the car makes, all the races for different years, and extremely full statistics. So if you need to hunt up something, you can do it very quickly on that site. There are a few mistakes here and there, but believe me, for a person who's researching racing or wanting to know about drivers and their careers, that's where to go. It's a really useful site, and I'm glad we have it. Any other questions? If not,
Hello, my name is Susan Webb.
oh yes, okay.
I have a question.
Yep.
My question is, who was the driver that won that race?
That won the.
The one you were talking about, the big race.
You mean the Indy 500 or
Yeah, the one that you were talking about. Yes.
the Indy car? Oh, it was. Of course, now I'm going to go out of my head. Yes, it was willpower. Yes, it was willpower for driving for Roger Penske. You're quite welcome. Sorry, I should have said that, but anyway. But again, the year before, well, very few people would remember. It's not. We're not anywhere near where we should be. But thanks again. I appreciate it, and always enjoy coming here.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you.